I'm Hiko, the Master Baiter, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.
Cloud9's CSGO team is not good enough. Obviously, I'm referring now to the current lineup, the former ATK squad, and like I said, when they picked this team up, it does not look like there is even the potential in this team to be anywhere near a good team, and forget be a team worthy of the Cloud9 org, the Cloud9 name, and the history that being a major winning org, an org that's had certain times like a top 5 ranked team in the world, I think it deserves to be the kind of squad that plays them. I don't think this team is in that category. So one of my issues is, it's not just that they don't look good enough now, it's that I don't think they'll ever be a top 10 ranked team. I mean, if they are, they'll only be there very briefly, like a month or something, they'll drop right out. They will never contend for big titles or go deep in majors. I mean, when I say go deep, I mean like make the semis, have a chance of winning. I'm not talking about like if they manage some like absurd Quantum Bellator Fire style fluke where you just make the top 8 somehow, which by the way is a lot harder now that they have the best of 3s involved. If you look at the results this team had, they didn't even make a deep run when they went to a dream hack, when we're talking about a tier 2 dream hack. They got smashed at IEM Katowice. You're going to say, yeah, but Fire Strauss. Yeah, also by NiP, when NiP had their brand new squad and was a teething team, whereas this lineup had already existed for months and had played a few LANs. Then you look online, even going online hasn't elevated them that much for my money. Like, yeah, they finished 4th in Flashpoint. Not that great when you consider it was below Havu, who was a fucking like team that didn't even qualify and just got invited after the fact, and below MIBR with Mayan, who was considered a failed lineup that again themselves aren't reasonably going to be top 10. They're not, if you compare them to some of the other squads out there, they're not like an NA version of Mad Lions where there's pieces there and just give them more time to develop, and I like some of the things they're doing. This team, for me, it's plateaued. I've already seen everything. They feel like a known quantity generally, and I just don't see that you could get enough improvement across the board to make them a top team, especially for Cloud9. There's the key part for the org Cloud9. If they want to play for a smaller org, if someone else wants to pick them up and just have them be, I don't know, 16th best team in the world, that's cool with me. That's fine. No problem with that. I'm talking about for Cloud9. So if you want to start with the problems with this team, because the interesting thing is they're not a bad team in all senses. They have some redeeming qualities. They have some things I actually even enjoy about them. But I tell you what, one thing I do not enjoy about them, and my biggest problem immediately, is I always say this. As much as I appreciate teams that don't have to just rely on skill and don't just play off individual ability and definitely don't play selfish, I always say you have to have enough firepower, enough skill. Cloud9 doesn't have enough skill. Like, you look at their firepower, Floppy's pretty good, and even then, that was largely online until this year. But okay, he showed some signs offline, and online he's looked pretty good. He looks like far and away the best player of this team now. I'd certainly put my money on him. So okay, he's good. There's one piece. But if I'm being honest, even then he's not like a superstar hard carry. Like, Floppy realistically needs to be like probably your 3rd best fragger on this team if you want to be a team that's, forget just top 10, like contending, top 5. Like, maybe he could be your 2nd best if he cleans his act up on LAN and becomes more consistent. Okay, but then you need him to be partnered with a big time superstar. So elsewhere in the lineup, you can forget about it. Like, there's one other player I find to be, in terms of individual play, not bad, which is Orsi. And actually, he's the guy where if you go and watch my original video about this lineup, I actually wrote this guy off completely. I didn't think he could change, but that's also because it seems to me like they've changed up his role and he's changed up his mentality, where he's gone from being that incredibly boring, just hold the line AWPer, just hits the normal shots, to now he can be a little bit more aggressive, he can move around a little bit more, sometimes he has big games, and I feel like he's the main player, aside from Floppy getting his shit together on LAN, who seems to have improved to me. The saddest thing about this lineup, and I still don't think Orsi can be a good enough player, because the problem is, if you want to be a top 10, a top 5 team, you need to have one of the best AWPers. AWPer cannot be the role where you're carrying dead weight or just an okay AWPer. Tell you what, the players who do the worst when they go up to tier 1 are tier 2 AWPers, because they get murked by the tier 1 AWPers. They get eaten alive, and the riflers are just at a level they're not used to dealing with. They cannot adapt. So the big problem is, look at Gratisfaction in 100 Thieves. For me, he was the main player who held them back most of the times, being unable to match up with the best AWPers. It's actually part of the reason they didn't even make the major final. You go and look at, I actually think a good past example would be Henny on the Immortals lineups. For me, he just wasn't a good enough AWPer. Now, I will say, he's a rare example of someone who really late in his career, relative to how long most playing careers are, seems to have started to turn it around. I think in conjunction with all the failed opportunities he's had and how this new team works, because he was coming into a team that already was better than he the level he was at. I'm actually impressed with how Henny over the last month and the last 3 months, and since he joined Furia generally, has sort of changed his game and his style. But I don't see it happening in terms of OC. So then you come to the others, and we've got issues individually here, boys. Like Sonic, on paper, looked like the best player coming to this team. He was their best player at the beginning. He's been pretty underwhelming since. And this year, he has just been nothing compared to what he was in the past and in Envy. So I think this guy's pretty underwhelming now. I don't really see the appeal of his game. Motum is good on T-sides. Like, he does a good job as an entry. Certainly seems like he has that mentality of like press W, run through a brick wall if the IGL says, I like that, but he hasn't got good enough skills. He reminds me in some senses of like a modern day Freakazoid in that regard. Like, if he's my worst player, we can make it work, if we've got some really good players elsewhere. If he's supposed to be one of my fraggers or players that's contributing, now we're going to have issues if we ever want to be relevant. Which leaves one player left, the IGL. Now, the IGL, as an IGL, I actually think does a pretty decent to good job. He's certainly not one of the best IGLs in the world. He lacks like the adaptation, the ability to read mid-round, in my opinion. But in terms of executing, coming up with tactics, studying the opponent, seems like JT does a good job. The problem is, it reminds me a little bit of when Hunden was on Mad Lions. Even though they're doing their job as an IGL, he's just too bad a fragger. His raw individual skills, they're not good enough. They're just not. Now, against lesser opposition or online, he can sometimes make it work. Like, he will play positions smartly. He's not like MSL in that sense, where I always used to think CT side, MSL. Like, he's just convinced himself he's a really good player in ways that I have always thought were absurd and did hold his teams back. JT tries to play around not having great aim and play off people. It's just that'll only get you so far. And in the modern day, when CT sides get punished so heavily by the economy, if you can isolate him, if you can fuck with his sight, if you can figure out where you can get fights with him, he can be a free kill. And that is a problem in a squad that already lacks of firepower and big game changer type figures. So the problem with the lack of firepower, I always say this, is if you have a really good tactical T-side and a well-constructed, well-balanced squad, you can make the T-side work on most maps and against most teams. You can match up well there. And actually, this team often can do that. The problem is, where firepower will always be exposed, as you might be able to tell by how I characterise JT, is on the CT side. You can figure out where the weak players are. Not enough teams can swap positions. You can isolate them. You can use utility to fuck with them. You can obviously just take straight up aim duels. And you find the weak point and you smash that door wide open from getting that elbow in there. So the problem is, it leads to weak CT sides when you don't have enough firepower. And this is a team that is a prime example of weak CT sides. I went back, and since the beginning of May, I counted up, and by my count, they'd played 32 CT sides of maps, and they had only won, as in either won the game on that side, or more importantly, like had won out that side, so like got the rounds necessary, or got 8 or more rounds. They only did it 11 times out of 32. That is 34% of the time they win the CT side. That is just not good enough, and especially because you might be thinking, well, what maps do they play? Because that's very relevant to how many CT sides you win, how many CT rounds you win. And remember, I'm not talking about getting 12 rounds, 10 rounds. I'm just saying just get 8 CT rounds. Only 8 of those 32 maps were Dust 2, the T-sided map in the pool. Beyond that, in theory, every other map in the pool right now is CT-sided. Yes, at times, Inferno Mirage can be more in the middle. Vertigo, actually, I would say is more of a specialist map. Depends if you have a shit T-side, it's totally CT-sided. But you see, when teams are competent, it's a real close battle. It can be those 8-7s, those 9-6s. But even so, only 8 times was it Dust 2, the clear-cut T-side map. And by the way, a map that they like to play quite a lot. Then you go and look at the other maps they've played. How about a train CT-sided map, right? They've won 1 out of 4 CT sides. Vertigo can be very CT-sided, and they've actually tried to at times play that and have it as a joker pick in there. They played it 3 times. They lost all 3 CT sides. Overpass can be a mega CT-sided map. It's a map they've also tried to flex into to expand their map pool. They won it 2 times out of 4. That is nowhere near good enough if you're choosing to play Overpass, by the way. And then Nuke. Historically one of the more CT-sided maps, but admittedly with the current economy, yeah, it's become a little bit more even, especially with this fucked up pissed around scenario for the Ts. But even so, 4 times they played Nuke, they only won CT side twice. So they don't have winning CT side records on 4 of the CT sided maps. One of the reasons why is the players I outlined who are the best individually, Floppy, OC, they're the only players who can reliably frag on those sides. And in fact, on certain maps, most notably, I would say OC on Vertigo and Floppy on Vertigo and Inferno, it has to be those players going ham on CT side. Or sometimes they can't match up with even teams around or slightly below their level. So when you look at the rest of the squad, like Motum, in the same way as on T-side, he's got that plus W religion. Unfortunately, that applies to CT side. Like, he only is effective when he does basically like wild card pushes and flanks. But if you look at maps where you have to just stay in the site and play the site, like when he plays Big Pit on Inferno A, that is fucking garbage. He is not a good enough player at all. You'd be lucky if he gets the 1 kill. Never mind get more than that, which is usually the metric for being able to play Inferno. One of the reasons why I've never believed in their Inferno, no matter what the results were. And they never were that great, by the way. On the T side, listen, they can be good. Like, the problem is they're too limited by the execute style. Like, it does make them, I will say at times, satisfying to watch, because you go, fucking hell, look at this. Like, this style can give you limited success over stronger players and stronger teams. Reminds me of the MSL dig teams before he got the really good players, before Magisk and Config fully developed, back when he had AZ and Pimp and Tensky and these guys, Rubino. So, for me, I used to enjoy watching the T sides of those teams. Hated watching the CT side at times. So, the interesting thing for me is you look at the map pool in light of the 4 CT sides, and you start to see again the problems this team has. You don't have to be a top 10 team to be very good on a certain map. Like, there can be a map where you can just be specialists on it. Like, classically, if you remember, Space Soldiers used to be specialists on Cobblestone. There's a whole bunch of maps in history. Obviously, like fucking some of the, I mean, who else would we pick for that? Like Vega Squadron or Mirage or whatever. There was maps always out there that they could be specialists on. But you look at this team's map pool, right? Since the beginning of May, they have a winning record on one map in the entire pool, and that's Vertigo, a map most teams don't play. And even then, they won 2-1. And yes, you know what? They had some good wins. They'd win over Gen G, win over Team Liquid. They're even on a 2-game winning streak as a result, but they lost to 100 Thieves, team that's actually on the downfall, and they lost all the CT sides there. So is that even that good a map? Not really. Then you go and look elsewhere, right? They have losing records on 2 maps, Dust 2 and Mirage. Well, Dust 2 is their most played map, so you can see the problems already. They've lost to Triumph there, lost to EG, MIBR, Team Liquid. Like, yeah, you know what? They've beaten a few good teams as well. They've lost their last 3 on that map. So the problem here is, when you're looking at their map pool, for me, the best map, I think, with the eye test and the general results, if you parse them and try and gauge what the strength of the results, I think their best map overall is Train. Like, that's a map where they've beaten EG, pretty solid team. They've beaten Gen G on it and lost to Gen G as well. And they've at least won a CT side on that map. I'll give them that. I think Vertigo, as much as not many teams play it, but even then they've got bad CT sides. Dust 2, I think it's kind of questionable, but it's already in the middle to slightly up in their map, which shows the problems they have. Then you have Overpass. They've tried to make it work. They've lost to Envy on it. Yes, fucking Envy. They've lost to Team Liquid on it. Team Liquid's had their own issues on that map recently. Then you go to Nuke. Again, they're trying to play the map. They're pretty even in terms of a lot of the maps they're playing in terms of frequency. That's a map where they've lost to EG on it, Team Liquid on it. They won against 100 Thieves, but 100 Thieves lost to a lot of teams on that map, unfortunately. You go to Inferno, a map that they've just never made work, in my opinion. They've lost to MIBR on that, Gen G on that. They've won against Team Liquid because inexplicably they got that series win over Team Liquid. Okay. And they've won some CT sides. But you know what? That's not good enough, in my opinion, to actually make them relevant, because that's one of the most played maps in the scene. Then you go to Mirage. They only played it once and they lost to 100 Thieves on it. Okay, like, this is kind of underwhelming stuff. Where are the strengths in this map? Where am I supposed to feel confident they can get a win in a best of 3 and compete with the best teams? Where is their killer map? Notice how weak they are on those fragging maps as well. Then you look at, right, okay, even their recent results, not bad in the Road to Rio, obviously did decent in Flash, but it's all online shit. Like, nobody knows what they're going to do offline. There's no guarantees at all they'll even be as good as they were online. In fact, I would bet they won't be. I would bet actually teams like Gen G will be much better offline than they were online and will be miles ahead of this squad. So the main problem, like I said at the beginning, it's not that they can't play pro Counter-Strike, they have to be kicked out and exiled. It's that they're not good enough for an org like Cloud9, an org with history and prestige, major winners. They're not good enough a squad that has the backing that they have the ambitions that they have. I know they want to have one of the best teams in the world, especially now with Flashpoint existing as a viable alternative to be moving towards monetization options. So what do you do is the question, right? I'll tell you straight up, if I was the GM of this team, I would just get an entirely new lineup, and I would make sure it was either a super team built some of the best players in the world where you feel like you has to have a good chance of succeeding, or I would just go and I would pay top dollar and buy a top 5 ranked lineup in the world, especially with Flashpoint existing as a justification for that. And as far as I know, it's not impossible Cloud9 might do that at some point in time. It just depends what the markets say. Alternatively, if you don't want to fire everyone and get a new squad, or you can't just buy a guaranteed squad, right? If you're going to keep any members of this team, you could keep Floppy. I'm not against that, especially if it's going to be an NA squad. Okay, But like I said, he can't be the best player on the team. Maybe one other. So actually, even though you can think, should be OC based on what you said, like I said, I don't think AWPers like that make it at the top tier. So in my opinion, the only other player you would keep is maybe you keep JT for now, because he has the structure of the team around him, seems to do his job as an IGL, so you can fit some pieces in there. And if you fit in good fraggers, he doesn't have to frag as well. I still think eventually you've got to bite the bullet and you've got to do the Asilian for Hunden type gamble move. It just has to be done. So then you go, as I said with OC, it doesn't work. Sonic for me is a bust. I wouldn't invest in him if I wanted to be a top team. Mottom's too inconsistent. I think the eye test shows that his skills aren't good enough. So to me, if you're going to keep flopping, you're going to bring in other people, they better be, first and foremost, at least one monster star player, both in terms of profile and game in the server. And then I also want at least a couple of good gambles on like potential next talent, like FPR style players. So in terms of the monster player, it better be literally a top 20 player in the world. That's who your superstar needs to be. In terms of the others, get a couple of those FPL type next stars. Fierce has done it a bunch of times. Obviously a bunch of other squads, Mouse have done it. Get a couple of those players. That's not a bad gamble. Beyond that, maybe the other player you need is a strong veteran role player. Someone who's smart, who can play that position, knows what they're doing in that sense. I'd like a move like that as well. So I think it's pretty obvious where Cloud9 is. I think they've plateaued. I don't believe in them as a squad. I think it's something, I won't say it's a totally failed project. It is in terms of the ambitions, but actually as a team, it's a functional team. It's just not good enough, quite frankly, across the board. And there's not enough redeeming qualities or players in the lineup for me to believe they can do much. This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Bobby, Dean Tanglis, Istar, JDubs, Jensen Goh, the Puyallup Tribe, Soliko, Spencer Green, Tobias Bernasconi, Xinged, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question in those AMAs I do each month. Do you want teasers for who's going to appear next on my content? Maybe you want to take part in one of those lengthy discussions about esports with me. Well, if so, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.